Welcome to episode 41 of the Tax Professionals podcast. Keith Gordon, tax barrister and keen tax writer, joins us in this episode for the fourth episode of Tax Career Success Secrets, where high-achieving tax professionals share the secrets behind career success.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Keith's a well-established tax barrister and keen tax writer. You'll likely find one of his articles in any tax magazine you pick up. Whilst I had read many of Keith's articles, I didn't know about his journey. He actually didn't start off training to be a barrister, and it's something he did around 10 years after working in tax. I'd always thought doing a law conversion whilst working would be tough, and well, for Keith it was even more challenging as he had a family of his own. He's a keen tax writer, writing many articles and books, as well as winning Taxation's Tax Writer of the Year in 2013. He's also won Taxation's Chartered Tax Advisor of the Year in 2009 and Outstanding Contributions in 2019. Despite the accolades and achievements, from the small time we spent together, one trait stood out to me and one I admire. Keith has always stayed true to himself, and there's a few funny anecdotes throughout this episode. The episode covers an overview of Keith's tax career, before moving on to Keith's experience of converting to a tax barrister and how he balanced studying, work and family at around 14 minutes. At roughly 22 minutes 30, Keith then shares his refreshing story on how he got into tax writing, along with some of his tax writing tips. The episode then finishes with Keith telling us about a standout piece of advice he received and his tips to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career at around 37 minutes 30. If you like this episode, be sure to take a listen to previous episodes of Tax Career Success Secrets with Bill Dodwell, the OTS Tax Director, Peter Rainey, the current President of the CIOT, and Nimesh Shah, tax partner and CEO of Blick Rothenberg. The next Tax Career Success Secrets episode is with Jenny Brown, who became tax partner at a young age. The episode is planned to go live on the 28th of February. Make sure you don't miss this and any other future episodes of the podcast by subscribing or signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. The email notifications will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide if you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. Without further ado, let's get to it. If you don't mind then, Keith, just to start us off today, could you tell us a little bit about you and your tax career?
Certainly. I studied mathematics at university between 88 and 91, and I went through my university career knowing that I wanted to qualify as a chartered accountant upon graduating. And that was a consequence of having had a year off between 87 and 88, in which I found myself working on different occupations around the City of London. So I knew I wanted to do something financial, but I had no idea what. Now, that was a year where there'd been a stock market crash, October 87. So opportunities into banking were not available. And the quid pro quo was when I spent 3 months with what is now KPMG, then Peter Mark McClintock. It was made very clear to me that one could go into chartered accountancy, one could qualify with no one having any real expectation that you would definitely stay on in the profession as a qualified individual. And in fact, there was a large expectation that people would leave with a very good, well-respected qualification. And more importantly, as people were losing their jobs in the city, it was considered at the time to be a safe qualification to have and therefore a guaranteed job for life. Now, as it transpired in the early 90s, a lot of accountants were losing their jobs. But by that time, I'd already committed myself down the accountancy route. And I kept an eye out at milk rounds, recruitment fairs, etc., throughout my 3 years at university, always going to the large firms who were presenting at those fairs, saying, well, I'm coming to join you as a profession in due course. I'm not sure which firm I will be applying to or which firms I will be applying to, but just making the contacts at that stage. And then at the November 1990 careers fair, so this was my beginning of my third year, I was looking at the recruitment brochures in a bit more detail and saw that there was an option of qualifying in a tax department. This was available for most of the big firms at the time. And I thought, actually, that possibly suits me more than the normal bread and butter for a graduate going into accountancy, being audit. And I thought about it a bit more. I spoke to my now late grandfather, who himself was a qualified chartered accountant, and he didn't think it was such a bad idea. And I was thinking that it was possibly more intellectually challenging than audit, and possibly slightly more regular office hours than audit would offer. And whilst I enjoyed my sort of audit experience that I'd had with KPMG, I thought this is probably the thing to go for. The other advantage was I always saw that audit was seen as a burden for the client, whereas tax advice was something that they positively sought. So I could see that I was offering that added value, or be potentially part of a team that would be adding value. So I applied to various firms, and I was particularly attracted to one through their recruitment process, and joined what is now one of the big four firms in January 1992. So I am now approaching my 30th anniversary in the tax profession, which makes me sound horrendously old. I don't feel old, but 30 years does seem rather long in the tooth when I say it in those terms. It must be stated, however, that my love affair with tax was seriously challenged in those early years. I'm not going to say that there's anything wrong with big four firms. I'm not going to say there was anything wrong with the big four firm I worked for. However, there was a combination of possibly personalities involving my own, possibly circumstances in that we were coming out of a recession at the time, and possibly just certain individuals that I was working with and the structure of that particular department I was stationed in. But it became rapidly clear that I was not happy at that firm, but I decided to stick it out for the full 3 years to get my qualification. And I did. I passed my ICAEW exams. The last set of results came out in the middle of February 1995, and I was already under notice, or I had given notice at the beginning of the month, so as to leave at the end of February, irrespective of the outcome of my results, because I knew that I wasn't going to be motivated to retake them if I were employed in that firm, and I wanted a fresh start. So I knew I could either leave on the 28th of February newly qualified, or leave and have to retake, but would be more motivated outside the firm than within. And fortunately, I passed. I was newly qualified. I kept myself doing non-tax or even non-accounting things for a few months. But by the end of the year, found myself working for a small to medium-sized firm in the West End of London, where it was a very different experience. I was effectively the tax manager of the firm, the tax guru. And if there were things that were beyond my knowledge and expertise, we effectively then outsourced that to a consultancy firm, which no longer exists, but has seen many sort of rivals, most recently Gabel, in that sort of part of the market. I used that time to take my, what are now known as CTA exams, then known as ATII, taking the exams in May 97, passing in July 97, and becoming what is now a CTA. I also joined a larger medium-sized firm which specialised in high net worth individuals, and probably would have stayed there for the long term, but for the fact that I spotted an advert in autumn of 1998 for what is now known as or what became known as the Tax Law Rewrite Project, then known as the Tax Simplification Project. And I had in my mind at the time, whether it's right or whether it's wrong, that one's career in tax, if you do intend to specialise in tax, would not be done any harm by spending a bit of time at the revenue. And this was a technical project, effectively a legal project, working on rewriting tax statutes. So they broadly said the same as they did previously, but in a clearer style, clearer layout. And I took the role on. One was able to apply for either any period between 2 and 5 years. So I went for the 2-year option, thinking I was keeping my options open, and was working on what became the Capital Allowances Act of 2001. But at the time, I then started getting the law bug, because I realized that tax was an interesting area of law where most issues are dealt with by non-lawyers, whether it's tax inspectors, they were generally known as in those days, and tax advisors, accountants, or CTAs. But when it comes to a dispute in tax, it gets resolved by the lawyers, whether it's by counsel or by the judges. And I thought it would probably make sense, actually, to study some more law. And I thought one of the things I enjoyed doing at the time was writing, and I did a bit of consultancy work on the side. I thought being at the tax bar would be an appropriate way to go forward. So I requalified. I did my law conversion course, now known as the PGDL, Postgraduate Diploma in Law. I think, no, it was then called the Postgraduate Diploma in Law. It's now called the Graduate Diploma in Law. Or if it's not called that anymore, it was called that for some time. And I did that part-time alongside my work at the Revenue. And when that took 2 years rather than the 1 year, which one normally does it full-time, that took me until September 2002. I then, in the meantime, I'd been able to extend my 2-year fixed-term contract until I'd finished my law training. I then left to do a full-time bar course so as to become a fully qualified barrister minus the pupillage. So I was called to the bar in July 2003 and then did pupillage the first 6 months in a tax set, the second 6 months in a general chancery litigation set, which was very useful because I got a lot of experience if caught in my second 6 months, and was then now a fully qualified barrister, able to do anything I wanted, provided I was in chambers. And I found a tenancy, effectively the ability to practice properly, in a public law set known as Atlas Chambers, which didn't do tax at first, but the tax work I was doing was quite complemented what was happening in the set. And within a few years, a number of other tax practitioners joined the set, so that by about 2013, we were probably half non-tax and half tax. Then, due to a rearrangement in chambers, the chambers effectively joined a large public law set. The tax practitioners formed a set within a set, and we rebranded ourselves as Atlas Tax Chambers, and were effectively a small specialist tax set. And at the end of 2014, we got snapped up by Temple Tax Chambers, which is where I've been a member ever since.
So it sounds like actually you almost had 10 years ish experience in tax before you actually decided to go down the barrister route. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the interesting things is there are a number of barristers who specialize in tax who have previously worked in accounting firms and are qualified as chartered accountants. But what I realized, not immediately, but subsequently, was that they tended to make the transfer at 2 stages in their career. Some went immediately, they got the they got the chartered accounting qualification and then went straight to the bar. And those who came in when they'd already been partner, often in a large firm, for a number of years, Now, if you go in straight at the beginning of your career, you're not necessarily at a stage in life where you need to be earning large sums of money to support yourself or family. And if you come in at a later stage in your career, you've usually got a financial cushion that will allow you to will support you during the early years at the bar. I decided to go in the middle, by which time I didn't have the financial cushion to rely on, but I also had a family requiring me to support them. So it was an interesting time to go, but I seem to have survived, and I'm not necessarily sure I would recommend it. And also the conversion process is quite an ordeal. So also I wouldn't recommend, unless you had what I had, a very supportive spouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It sounds like actually you kind of went into it knowing that it was going to be difficult for you, I think, by the sounds of it. So, you must have really wanted to go into the law side of things, to take on all that extra, I suppose, pressure and challenge to have the conversion.
I knew it would be difficult. I don't think I knew how difficult it would be. So doing a conversion course part-time is not a walk in the park. It required, certainly with the outlet where I studied, the course was 2 evenings a week. But I felt in order to maximize my chance of doing well at the course, I found myself doing 2 evenings a week on top of study, plus a full day, 1 day each weekend. And that's more or less what the college would recommend. Now, whether or not everyone does it, I very much suspect not. But that's where it starts getting difficult on family time. And also what happened was I was working at the Revenue, and if I left work, let's say 6 o'clock, I'd be home at 7. By that time, I'd then want to have something to eat, and wouldn't really get myself able to start work till about 8 o'clock, by which time, how many hours can one really put in with motivation to do properly at that stage? And I realized that wasn't working. So what I ended up doing was going straight from the work, which was Bush House in central London, to the college, which was BPP, which was only about a quarter of a mile away. Went straight from work, did 3 hours then, leaving at about 8 o'clock, 8:30, and effectively walking home with a packed supper sandwich. So being in a library and being less tired, I was able to get a lot more out of work. But again, that then has impact on family life. So that's why you do need either to be single and single-minded, or have a very, very supportive wife or spouse.
Yeah. So you obviously mentioned that a couple of times now about having the supportive spouse. So, kind of what were the challenges, I suppose, that you had at the time then when you were doing this? Was it making sure you had enough time for your spouse and your family, as well as doing the studying and kind of fitting it all in?
Yes, I think that was probably the main challenge. Just actually sort of recognizing that there are other commitments other than work.
Yeah.
And if you're out, as I was, 4 evenings a week, 2 officially at college and 2 studying, that doesn't leave and 1 day of the weekend, that doesn't leave a great deal of time for family. But yes, I would like to have been able to spend more time. And yes, I came second in my cohort at the end of the exams. So that could mean either 2 things. Yes, the amount of work paid off from that perspective, or perhaps I could have taken my foot off the pedal slightly, not done quite as well, but got the balance slightly right. I don't know. The problem for me is if I'm doing exams, if I'm studying a course, I'm not someone who likes to do it in an amateurish way. So I fear that family probably bore the brunt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I suppose really then is what you would recommend to people is that they either did it at that kind of early stage in their career or at that later point when they've got that financial cushion, etc. Do you think that would be the best option for most people?
I think it's certainly worth considering, but also depends on what makes you happy at your particular stage in life. What I did do is the bar course I did full time, and that was quite interesting. The course itself was Monday to Thursday, and I did not, in the course of that year, I did not touch that course at all outside those days, Monday to Thursday. I went in the morning. I found myself seated at one of the computer desks and just did all my work within the 4 days between lectures and in the evenings, but none of that course encroached upon Friday, Saturday, or Sunday.
Yeah.
And in many ways, people used to refer to the computer I usually sat at as my desk because they knew that they could usually find me there. And I had the advantage of being roughly 10 years older than most of the fellow students, and therefore I had a slightly different approach to work-life balance. An example I would usually give is that if there were an hour's gap between lectures or classes, many people in their very early 20s would think of that as just an opportunity to have a chat with one's friends. And I don't wish to deprecate that idea. But for me, that was an hour to get work done. So I went in with the attitude, this is a job and I'm going to deal with it in a professional fashion. And the fact that I did not have to touch any of that work on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I think means that actually I got the balance probably far better. Therefore, a full-time course, if you can actually afford not to work during the most of the week, is fine. Now, I was doing consultancy work, I was doing writing work, and possibly even some lectures. So I was earning, but I was able to fit everything in to either the Friday, bit on the weekend, or even on top of the lectures from my bar course. But the point is, the bar course work did not go beyond Monday to Thursday.
Yeah. I think, obviously, massive kudos to you for doing that. I mean, I've actually considered myself whether I'd want to do a conversion to law as well, but I've turned myself off it because of the amount of work that I know goes into it. And I think you've probably solidified for that with me, actually, with some of the things you've said today. But it's actually quite interesting, kind of the way you've approached it, because I also did a master's degree, actually. And I even had the same thought process right at the start before I went into tax as well about, like, do I want to do accountancy, finance more generally? And I fell into tax. Moving on then, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was tax writing. It's obviously something you've been doing for a very long time now. And I think when we spoke last time, you had something like 219 articles already written for Tax Advisor, which is obviously a lot of articles. And I know you've done writing outside of that as well for other magazines and even a few books. What made you kind of want to get into tax writing, and how did you get into tax writing?
I think I've always had enough of an ego to see my name in print. So that is probably the honest psychological motivation at the end of the day. But it all started when I was working at that small to medium-sized West End firm in the mid-1990s. At the time, I was studying for my tax exams. And there was a slightly older member of staff. I think technically he was a consultant, but he was there regularly. He died, I believe, quite young, but a lot of respect for him. And he told me that when taxation came out, and remember, most people read it then in those days, everyone read it in hard copy, he would always look at the readers' forum and try to answer the questions. And that inspired me to look at the readers' forum and try to answer the questions. And roughly the time I was taking my tax exams, I started sending in answers to some of the questions. And the first one to be published was round about April 1997, which was the month before I took my exams. And once I got one published, I found I was getting them published quite regularly over the next few months. So I was enjoying that, and that was quite a good exercise, both in the writing and in the technical skills. And this was the time when self-assessment was coming in, and we had rules for the new basis periods, which are all going to go out in a few weeks' time, or a few months' time. But it was all new there. And therefore, a lot of the questions that people were posing did relate to TMA and the self-assessment rules. So I did become what I would think a self-assessment guru, because I was studying all of these rules through my tax training. And by the end of 97, I was also attending the London branch of the CIOT's meetings. And one of the committee members at the time was Malcolm Gunn, who was then the editor of taxation. And I introduced myself by reference to the pseudonym under which I was writing. So even though I say that I like to have my name in print, I was actually doing all this under a pseudonym. And he said, well, why don't you just write an article for the main part of the magazine? And that inspired me to think, okay, maybe I can do this. And the first article I wrote, if I remember correctly, was just a summary of how marginal tax rates can sometimes be surprising. Now, a lot of the cliff edges in tax, which were there at the beginning of 1998, have been removed. The most obvious examples are to do with national insurance, where people like you would just not believe quite how national insurance worked in those old days, but it was a bit like the old rules for stamp duty and stamp duty land tax, that if you just go above a particular threshold, then you have to pay the tax or the duty at the higher rate on the full slab of your earnings or the consideration, rather than just paying in the way tax normally works at the rates on the particular slices. So I just went through a number of areas where you could find yourself with some unusual marginal rates. Now, as I said, most of those have been ironed out, but there's another whole set of odd marginal rates. The most obvious one, when you have the high income child benefit charge applying. But you've also got that funny rate when people's got income over £100,000 and their personal allowance gets tapered away, because whilst we all know that the top rate of income tax at that stage is about 60%, politicians don't like to have, they say you're only paying 40% of that rate. It's just you're losing a personal allowance, £1 in every two. Obviously, it means the same thing, but politically, 40% sounds better than 60%. So it's an area which has always interested me. So that was my first article I wrote, but not the first article that was published, because I then had an oddity which came about, which inspired me to write another article, and I've just been writing ever since.
That's actually really quite an interesting way as to how you got into that. And I actually really like that person's approach to trying to answer all of the readers' questions in taxation. I think a lot of people who work in tax kind of neglect the technical side to the detail of using legislation and in-depth going into guidance, etc. And I think that's a really good way actually to build a strong core in technical ability. And then obviously it's allowed you to get into tax writing as well, which is obviously two birds with one stone almost, because it's something that you've obviously enjoyed since.
Absolutely, still do, as you know.
So then, obviously, a magazine article is very different to writing a full book. So how did you kind of transition into that, and what have you found, I suppose, challenging about writing books?
The most challenging is the time. And how did I transition? It probably just evolved. I can't sort of say what it was that suddenly made something go from A to B. Actually, I think I can now you mention it. I had written a series of articles in taxation in the late 1990s on the taxation of different professions. And actually, now I remember it. I was going to say, and then one of the editorial staff, Richard Curtis, then thought that might make a very good book. And if I actually remember what happened, I think I was actually asked to write a book. I'd started writing the chapters. The book didn't ever get published. So I then used the chapters as individual articles. So it then became full circle. I'd completely forgotten that. So answering your question, I cannot remember how I actually transitioned into writing books. But you've got a little anecdote there out for nothing. The difficulty is finding the time. And most editors, publishers will say barristers aren't very good at meeting deadlines because work has a horrible habit of cropping up and getting in the way. Most are quite tolerant of that. But I remember there was one book which I think it was my book on discovery assessments, which I'd been meaning to write for years and years and years. I knew that the problem wasn't so much the time to write, but waiting for the law to settle sufficiently to make it worth writing. And then once I'd felt we got to that stage, I then blitzed one chapter, which I knew would probably be the hardest to write, when I happened to have a spare few days. And then having written that chapter, I think I then was then motivated over the next few months to write the remaining ones. But generally, to write a new title from start is very difficult because of the time. With an existing title, what I generally do is keep it updated as there are developments going on. So every time there is a new bit of case law, a new bit of statute, I update it as much as I possibly can. Now, the book will then probably be quite bitty in that sense, but when it's ready to go to publication, then I read it all from beginning to end to ensure that there's some form of editorial coherence. But that's the way I do it, is by making sure that it's almost always up to, there's a version I've got electronically, which is almost always up to date.
It's a good approach, I think, to have that, because otherwise, things I suppose you're reading the extra case law and stuff that comes out anyway. So then it makes sense to almost take advantage of it while it's fresh in your mind and add it to your book, even though, you know, it's between 1 year and the next, and so then get it ready.
Absolutely.
I mean, in reality, how much changes do you then have to make sure that it kind of is all in like a good structure still, and it kind of flows well? I think you called it editorial cohesion. I mean, I'm sure you've got a good idea of what it's like anyway and fit it in fairly well anyway. Or do you find yourself making a lot of changes when you come back and review it?
Well, I think the best example is the book on discovery assessments, where I have just effectively signed off the latest edition. And on the whole, it's fair to say that most of the amendments I had made could just be left unchanged with possibly the odd typo. But there was one chapter which has had radical treatment and required a lot of rewriting, rearranging, so much so that even when I thought I finished it, I gave it a few days and reread it again to ensure that, as if it were a fresh piece of work. And that was the chapter which previously covered staleness of assessments, which seems to have died a death in the tooth case, but also the issue relating to standalone tax charges, so back to the high income charge benefit charge, where the revenue found out their cost in the upper tribunal earlier this year that they weren't generally able to recover the HICBC through a discovery assessment. So not only did I have to cover the case law on that, or reflect the case law, so the most recent case being the upper tribunal in June, but also the fact that the revenue are asking Parliament to legislate around this and are dealing with this in a retrospective fashion. So I had to deal with an awful lot of matters. So both the question of staleness and these standalone charges are possibly not completely dead, perhaps the staleness argument is, but there is still a live issue relating to standalone tax charges, but it's becoming more or less obsolescent. So I needed to reflect it in the text in a way that didn't give it undue prominence, but didn't dismiss it altogether. So that's why there was some radical surgery to my chapter 3.
Yeah, that makes sense. The thing is, I've got a few members of staff who are kind of getting into writing like letters and stuff for work advice, and we do a lot of picking stuff up and putting it down when we're waiting for more information to come from a client, etc. I think that's kind of where you kind of can have the problem that you're talking about, where you kind of plonk something in, it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the text. But it sounds like that's why you need that final review at the end, just to final check, make sure that everything does fit in the right place. And I think that's important because structure and flow, particularly for big documents, can make a difference between it being easily understood by its reader and not being easily understood by its reader.
Yes, I think it's very difficult when you do such on a client piece of work, stop and start. I have possibly the advantage of it's only my writing. I'm not generally having to deal with input from other people. But even so, one of my editors made the comment at one point thinking that I'd actually subcontracted some of my writing because he could detect a different writing style in the text. And I pointed out, no, it's only me. But if you imagine something, you can see it.
Obviously, you've been doing the tax writing for a long time, and I'll just throw in, for people who don't know, that you have won Taxation's Tax Writer of the Year. I think that was back in 2013. So have you kind of got any tips for people who are wanting to improve their tax writing so they can get better at it?
Write about something you find interesting. It's always much more helpful to write, but always ask for feedback, either from the editorial staff who will either reject or accept your article, trusted colleagues, or even senior members of the tax profession who do a lot of writing, who I'm sure will be more than happy to mentor up-and-coming writers. I recently was a judge in a competition for new writers in the tax profession, sponsored by the London Tax Network. So I'd be very surprised if anyone who writes regularly in the tax press wouldn't be willing to mentor people who want to do the same as them and effectively represent the next generation of tax writers.
Yeah, I remember reading actually about that that competition that you did. I was very tempted actually to enter, but it was on topics that are not really within my specialism. So it had taken so much research to get up to speed, and I just thought I wouldn't do them justice. So I actually shied away from it in the end. But I did think that seemed like a good competition for people who wanted to get into tax writing.
Yeah, it was fun reading the entries, all of whom were very interesting articles.
So kind of thinking about over the whole course of your career, which you've said I think spans like 30 years now. So it's a long time. Is there kind of a particular
Thank you for making me feel old, chap.
Got to point it out. Is there any particular piece of advice that you've received from someone else that you kind of just remember as being like a really great piece of advice that stood out and kind of stuck with you?
It's interesting how you worded that question, because I hope I'm not going to give away too many secrets. You sent out a list of likely questions a few days ago, and you asked for a standout piece of advice, whereas today you've emphasized a really good piece of advice. I'm going to answer the question that I believe you're going to ask, not the one you did actually ask.
Okay.
Which is always bad form, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I do remember a standout piece of advice, which I think was the most atrocious advice to give me. I hope you don't mind it.
Okay, no, of course, that's fine, yeah. I just, sometimes I improvise a little bit. We'll get into this.
I realise that. There's nothing wrong with improvising, but I'm going to do the politician's thing and answer the question I want to answer. I was a few weeks away from qualifying as a chartered accountant. So I was at this Big Four firm where, as I've already indicated, I was not overly happy. But one of the partners had a quiet word with me and said, "Keith, if you want to get on around here, don't ask so many bloody questions." Now, as I said, I think that was appalling advice. I possibly didn't enamor him. I probably didn't endear myself to him, if I got endearing the right way around. I probably didn't please him with my response to "don't ask so many bloody questions," because I said, "Why not?" And I explained to him precisely why I do ask questions. A lot of the time, and this was possibly just part of the problem I was experiencing, I was given tasks without any explanation as to what their purpose was, what the bigger picture was. I consider myself to be on a training contract, and therefore, as well as them paying for my exams, they were giving me practical learning on the job experience. And just acting like an automaton without understanding the relevance to a client, I felt I was not actually going to learn. So, as far as I'm concerned, and again, one of the questions you said, I think was the next question in your sort of list, was what's the best advice, what piece of advice would you give people? The first piece of advice was, do keep asking questions. Because particularly in tax, when things are always changing and things are never as simple as you always often think they are, if you don't ask questions, at worst, you'll become stale. Sorry, at best, you'll become stale. At worst, you'll just give the wrong answer. So if you're not asking questions, I think you're not interested in the subject. And if you're not interested in the subject, you really shouldn't be doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's appalling of the partner to say that, because I'm a big fan of questions as well, fully for the reasons that you've just said. I feel like that's the best way to learn, is when you're thinking about it and then you wonder and become intrigued as to, well, the answer to a question, and then you ask it. I think I've learned so much from asking questions, particularly in my early years, and even so now. So I find it quite amusing that you stood up for yourself in the way that you did, and basically sat out and explained to him why you asked the question. So I'm sure that put him in his place back in those days.
I'm not sure it necessarily put him in his place, but it meant he probably wasn't too sorry when I either told him I was handing in my notice or I had handed in my notice. But
yeah,
unfortunately, I think the issue is every employer has to make a decision, commercial decision, as to how they treat employees. And it might have been, at the time, I was not the right fit within the firm. My personal belief is that one should try to get the best out of one's employees, and different employees have different natures and different temperaments. But the point was, I saw it as an opportunity, without being too cheeky, to make the point and defend myself, rather than just simply meekly going off into the corner and not answering.
Yeah. It's a good point you made there as well, though, anyway, because there are different employers out there, and some are going to be a fit for you and some of them aren't. So really, I think what it kind of just emphasised to you was they weren't a good fit for you. It sounds like you had the decision in your head anyway that you wanted to move, but if you didn't at that point, it certainly solidified it for you to want to move at the end of your training contract, which sounds like the best thing for you to have done at that point. I think a lot of people are scared to move if they're not enjoying it.
It is difficult, because there was also a perception that if you left a big 4, big 6 firm as it then was, and didn't join another firm of the same size or a client, you were somehow a failure. And whether or not that perception existed, I wasn't going to let that deter me from doing what I felt was right for me.
Yeah.
And it certainly wasn't right. I wasn't right for them for me to stay either. Yeah,
I think it's a good thing to acknowledge that, I think, actually, though, isn't it? That's the thing. You acknowledge that it wasn't right for you and you did something about it. And a lot of people tend to acknowledge it, but are still scared to do something about it. But I think that's almost like a set way to just have a miserable career. And since you spend so much time at work, I think it's quite important that you do enjoy it. So I suppose it's just take some comfort in knowing that there is an employer out there that will be right for you and your traits and attributes.
Well, you say that. If you remember, for the last 15 or so years, I have been completely self-employed. Maybe one could say that there is no employer out there for me other than myself.
Well, if you're a person that needs to be self-employed, then that's the answer for you, isn't it? It obviously works well for you and plenty of other people out there, I'm sure. That obviously comes with its own challenges of having to I suppose, get your own clients and win work, etc. But that's a whole different episode, I think. Kind of knowing what you know now then, Keith, I won't reiterate the length of time you've worked in tax, but if you could give your younger self some advice now, knowing what you know now, what do you think it would be?
Oh, that's a very good question. Look, I think the way I'd put it is, knowing what I know now, would I have gone through the hardships of requalifying as a barrister? And I think knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't, unless I was able to persuade my wife, or my wife was probably more likely, my wife would be able to persuade me it's worth it in the long run. I think I would have been put off because of the conversion process, whereas my wife was probably able to look at the longer picture. And I think there's a good example of this in early 2006. At the time, I was looking for a tenancy, and I was given the opportunity to work for an extremely prestigious law firm in their tax team. And the great thing about that tax team is that they didn't specialize in only corporate or only personal tax, but they did both. So you get quite a wide range of experience. And there was a clear route to partnership, which would have been very remunerative. And it was a very, very attractive proposition. And I think I went through 4 interviews. I made it clear at an early stage that I wasn't necessarily sure I wanted to go into employment in a firm of solicitors. I was still thinking of going to the bar. And they said, yeah, we know you'll be completely fair, but at least go through the process. And I went through the process, and after 4 interviews, found myself offered this very tempting thing. I was thinking, well, actually, I've got certainty, I've got income. It's the least my family deserves after what was now approaching 6 years of uncertainty and a general lack of income. And my wife said, the problem is you will be unhappy. You'll be still wanting to be a barrister, still wanting to be self-employed. And she was willing to prolong the uncertainty for the sake of my happiness. So I think in a similar way, I might not have gone through the conversion process and just stuck with working for a very good firm of accountants and just become more technical guru, possibly doing the law very much as a part-time hobby rather than as a planned career change. But maybe my wife would have looked at the longer picture and saw what was really right for me.
Yeah, it sounds like you had amazing support actually from your wife through the whole process, from conversion to getting your position in the bar.
Still do.
Just the last one for you then, Keith. I know you've given obviously some tips and recommendations throughout this episode already, but just to kind of almost like finish the episode, for those who do want to get better, progress, develop, improve in relation to their careers, have you got kind of like 3 top tips that you think you can give them?
Yes, the first one is don't limit yourself to 3 and just answer them, give the number that you want to give us. Yeah. So tip number 1, keep asking those bloody questions. Tip number 2, don't necessarily be as undiplomatic as I was back in 1995. Tip number 3, much more practical day-to-day advice. Now, one of the things as a barrister I do is a lot of writing, and I don't have the backup team or colleagues up the chain who review what you write. But I think nevertheless, the discipline that I give myself is probably appropriate for people, even if their work is being reviewed by other parties. And that's when you finish a piece of work, if at all possible, don't pass it to client, manager, or whatever until the next day, by which time you've reread it afresh. Now, sometimes you don't always have the luxury of waiting overnight. Perhaps leave it till after lunch, but somehow give yourself a complete break from the document and then read it afresh. And this goes back to what we were saying before when things are written piecemeal. But even if you've written something from beginning to end, just take a step back, not just for those typos, but just check you actually agree with what you're writing. Because there are times when I have a view on a particular legislative provision, which I would swear blind is the correct view. And then 24 hours later, I look at it again and think, actually, I'm not sure I agree with that view. I can see why I reached that view, but somehow that slight pause just allows you a bit of distance. Don't be so, whether this is tip number 3 or now moving on to tip number 4, but don't be so committed to your initial view of what you've written. Be flexible. And indeed, I was remembering an anecdote I heard, a barrister now deceased, but he was practicing up until his 90s. And I heard this probably at third or fourth hand. So take it with a slight pinch of salt. But a barrister was giving advice to some clients in conference. And the clients turned to him and said, "That's very interesting. But a year ago, you gave us the completely opposite advice." And the barrister, as quick as a flash, said, "That just shows how flexible I can be."
What a response. The thing is, though, it's so true actually about changing your view, particularly on legislation, because let's face it, a lot of legislation is ambiguous and there are different views that you can take in relation to what it actually means. I've done the exact same as you on things before, where I've taken a view one day, I've kind of discussed it with some people, I've slept on it, woken up the next day, completely disagree with myself, but as you say, still see how I come to that conclusion. I think what I've always found a bit harder actually is once I'm setting my view on something, is then listening to other people's interpretations of it as well. But yes, I suppose that's the importance of being flexible and still having an open mind in terms of other interpretations being there as well, because there's always quite a lot of interpretations that people can take, and all of them have some validity. You'll never know which one is the right one until it goes to a court, and judges, I suppose, conclude on it and make it precedent.
But remember that judges sometimes disagree with other judges.
Yeah.
There are lots of cases which go flip-flopping all the way up to what's now the Supreme Court.
Yeah, particularly with R35 and employment status cases, as you well know.
Yes, but those tend to be flip-flopping on the facts. But there are some where the interpretation of the law is a binary issue, yes or no. Mm-hmm. And the best example, I think, is the Arctic Systems case, which I don't know whether you remember, Jones and Garnett, which I was involved with I was watching in the early stages, but I was involved in the Court of Appeal in the House of Lords. And the two cases at times I was directly involved, the taxpayer won in the Court of Appeal in the House of Lords. But there were two questions, both a yes-no question. And even though the taxpayer won at both cases, both levels, the House of Lords said yes when the Court of Appeal had said no, and said no when the Court of Appeal had said yes. So these effectively completely disagreed with the Court of Appeal. But because the revenue needed a yes in both, the taxpayer was able to win at both levels. It just shows that things can get very difficult and uncertain.
It does. I think this is the biggest problem we have as tax professionals, is even judges don't agree. So, that's just a challenge that we have to live with, I suppose, and which is why we caveat our advice a lot of the time.
I've got another piece of advice, Jack, if you want. My final piece of advice, even more practical than spending, letting things settle overnight. And one thing I try to do every working day, and I probably miss it on just a few occasions, but take a lunch hour. It doesn't have to be a full 60 minutes, but take a full and proper break from work, away from your desk. The idea of, and just give yourself that mental recharge. Ideally, go somewhere, even if it's buying a sandwich, even if it's coming back and eating that sandwich at your desk. Don't do work whilst you're eating a sandwich. Just give yourself that mental break. And I just find that that's an extremely helpful way of being productive. By spending that hour not working, I'm probably able to work longer than if I'd spent that hour working.
And probably more productively as well.
Absolutely.
If you liked this episode, be sure to take a listen to previous episodes of Tax Career Success Secrets with Bill Dodwell, OTS's Tax Director, Peter Rainey, the current President of the CIOT, and Nimesh Shah, Tax Partner and CEO of Blick Rothenberg. Links to these will be in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP41. The show notes also include where you can find out more information about Keith. The next Tax Career Success Secrets is with Jenny Brown, who became tax partner at a young age. The episode is planned to go live on the 28th of February. Make sure you don't miss this and any other future episodes of the podcast by subscribing or signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. The email notifications will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide if you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.